So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kate Brierton as this afternoon's presenter. Kate is an independent clinical psychologist and school governor. She completed her first degree at Cambridge University and followed this with a doctorate in clinical psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. After a career break, she returned to the profession as an associate lecturer for the Open University in psychology and counselling, before setting up her own private clinical practice in 2014. In her day job, she supports children with complex needs in both mainstream and special schools. She has a long-standing interest in education and became involved in school governance in 2015 as a founding trustee of the Morris Educational Trust. She currently sits on the local governing body of Impington Village College, which is local to Cambridge here, where she's worked with school leaders to develop a compassionate approach to well-being for both staff and students. So over to you, Kate.
Hello everybody, thank you Laura for the introduction, and thank you to everybody out there who's tuned in to listen to my webinar today. I always get really excited about delivering these webinars. It's such a pleasure to be able to present to teachers and educational managers from across the world. So very exciting. As Laura said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with children with special needs, so I'm in and out of schools most days with my day job, and I've also been quite involved with my local secondary school, which is where two of my children go, and that's a school that takes children from ages 11 to 18, and I've done a lot of work with them on helping them to improve the emotional with their staff and their students. And that's really through that work how I've come to realise the importance of the teacher-student relationship. I think it's vital not only to teacher wellbeing and student wellbeing, but also to the success of the school as a whole. So I'm delighted that you've tuned in to learn more about building compassionate teacher-student relationships today. So, this is what we're going to cover in today's talk. I'm going to start by giving you quite a brief introduction to the compassionate model of well-being, and just talk to you about where I've got my ideas from and the kind of model of well-being that I'm using, and why I think it's useful to think about that model in relation to well-being in schools, and particular in relationship to the relationships between teachers and students in schools. That model, part of that model is the 3 circles model, which is the emotional regulation systems in the brain, the drive, threat and soothe systems. So we're going to learn a bit more about those systems, how we move in and out of them across our daily lives, and how relationships play a really important role in helping us and our students to regulate their emotional systems. Then we're going to move on to think about what kind of relationships do we want to create with our students in the classroom. What makes a really high quality, supportive, compassionate relationship with a student? What does it look like? And I'm going to ask you to do an exercise at that point actually, and just to think about your own experiences at school and the relationships that you had with your teachers, because that's a really good way to learn. The wisdom lies within all of us, because nearly all of us will have had experiences in schools, and we can learn from that experience. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the attachment system, which is one of the most prominent theories in child psychology. And I'm going to explain to you about how our early experiences with caregivers can affect the way in which we relate to people later on. And that's interesting when you're thinking about the relationships in your classroom. A big part of attachment and emotion is the importance of non-verbal communication. And it's something that we don't always think about actually, but emotion is very much a non-verbal language. You can pretty much tell how somebody is feeling just by looking at them. They don't even need to say anything to you. And therefore the non-verbal communication that's going on in your classroom is really important to building good relationships. We're going to touch on what it's like to have challenging or difficult relationships with students. And we all experience relationships that can be challenging in different areas of our lives. That's part of the human condition. We find some people easier to relate to than others. And that's the same for all of us. But we're going to talk about some tips and techniques that we can use to help us in those situations. And then I'm going to think about and present some ideas that I've got from previous audiences who've listened to this talk. So top tips from teachers, from the experts, their ideas about how you can build great relationships with your students. But first of all, those people who've listened to me talk before will be familiar with this. I'm going to issue you with a compassion challenge. I go to a lot of learning events. I go to a lot of conferences, a lot of seminars. I listen to a lot of webinars. I like to invest in my own development. But I've learned over time that it's only a wise investment of my time if I commit to making a difference to my practice as a result of attending that learning event. So I want you to think about what the one thing is that you might do differently as a result of listening to this webinar today. And I've got my lovely picture of a sunflower there because that's a really helpful metaphor. That beautiful, tall, majestic flower grows from a very, very small seed. And that's a metaphor for the fact that we can make really quite small changes to our teaching practice, but they can result in really big differences in the classroom. So what's the one thing you might do differently as a result of listening to me today? And I'm going to come back and remind you of that at the end. And so to compassion. I am using a definition of compassion that was actually written by Paul Gilbert. And Paul Gilbert is a professor of psychology. He's based up in Derby in the Midlands of England. And he has spent the last 30 years developing his compassionate model of well-being. And he has a particular definition that he uses with regards to compassion. He says it's a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, and a commitment to alleviating that suffering. So there's really two components to compassion. We need to notice. That's the first thing. We need to notice suffering and distress, both in ourselves and others. And that's not always easy. We're busy people, we have a lot on, and to take the time and just notice what's going on for us and what's going on for the people around us is not always easy. And sometimes that's quite difficult too. Sometimes that can be quite upsetting. So it's a brave thing to develop that sensitivity to suffering. And the second part is making a real commitment to alleviating that suffering, taking responsibility, taking action. And all of you have already started that part because you've signed up to this webinar to help you improve relationships with your students in the classroom. So you've already made an excellent commitment to relieving any possible suffering and to help the students in your classroom flourish and thrive. So you're already compassionate teachers. So, as I said, the model of compassionate wellbeing was developed by Paul, and he spent the last 30 years developing it, and I love it. I use it in my work, in my professional career, and I also use a lot of the ideas in my own personal life too. And this is a really holistic model of well-being. It links evolutionary biology, neuroscience, sociology, and psychology into a holistic model. And I'm going to pull the sociology out of that middle box there and just focus on that for a moment, because the compassionate model of well-being acknowledges how important the social interactions we have with other people are to our own well-being and to their well-being too. And sometimes in approaches to well-being or in psychological models, social interactions are kind of ignored, but actually our social environment is key to our flourishing and thriving. Another key idea in the compassionate approach is that 21st century living can be really challenging due to the way that our brains have evolved. We have tricky brains. So nobody sat down with a pen and a piece of paper and designed a brain for the 21st century. That's not what our brains were like. Our brains haven't been designed. They have evolved over millions of years. And that means we have some very old parts of our brain and some newer parts of our brain. In the older parts of the brain, actually, we have 3 layers. So we have the very ancient part of our brain structure, which is actually based on the reptilian brain. Overlaid on top of that is the mammalian brain. And then humans have another layer, the neocortex, which forms most of our frontal lobes and the front part of our skulls, which makes us unique as a species. So the neocortex is the part of the brain that gives us all our wonderful human qualities. It gives us creativity, imagination, problem solving, organisation, communication, collaboration. So that's the neocortex. But as a kind of side effect of evolution, the old parts of the brain, which are where emotions are situated, and the newer parts of the brain, which is where our imagination is situated, can sometimes interact in unhelpful ways. And we're the only species in which this happens, actually. We can imagine things that might go wrong. And no other species can do that. So we can start imagining what might go wrong, and we can start to feel anxious. That will trigger the old part of the brain into an anxious state of being. Then what happens is the old part of the brain triggers the new part of the brain, even to thinking about other things that might go wrong. And then thinking of other threats in our environment triggers more anxiety. And we can get stuck in these really unhelpful loops of thinking and feeling. And that's the new brain and the old brain going sort of round and round. Our brains are tricky. It's part of the human condition. It causes us quite a lot of stress in the 21st century. It's not our fault. The good news is that with warm, supportive, compassionate relationships around us, we can manage those emotions much better. We can learn to regulate our emotional systems, and you can learn to do this in the classroom too. So here are the 3 circles. So these symbolize the 3 main emotional systems in the brain, and I'm just going to take you quickly through them because they're a really good way of understanding what's going on for yourself in terms of emotions, and also what's going on for your students. So the drive system, let's start with the blue circle, the drive system. This system is all about wanting, pursuing, achieving, progressing. It's all about setting a goal and working really hard to achieve it. So of course we do want to get our students into drive quite a lot of the time. It's an enjoyable system. It's a positive system, so that when we enjoy our goals, we feel really good about ourselves. We feel really good about the world. And the hormone that underlies it is dopamine. In evolutionary terms, this is the term that helps animals go out into the environment, find food, find shelter, and find a mate to reproduce with. So that's its kind of purpose in evolutionary terms. But of course, we use it in much more sophisticated ways in our human societies. Down at the bottom there, you've got your threat system, the red circle. This is a very strong system. and it's focused on keeping you safe. Focused on survival, focused on keeping you safe. And the emotions that are associated with being in this system are anger, anxiety, and disgust. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with those emotions. They're very powerful emotions and they urge us to take action. The hormones underlying that are adrenaline and cortisol. I think one important message to take from today's talk about the threat system, it's a very sensitive system, because in evolutionary terms that's been successful. Organisms that were very sensitive to threat in their environment tended to survive longer and be more likely to reproduce and be able to look after their offspring than organisms that weren't so sensitive. So the threat system is quite sensitive, and we are easily triggered into states of anger and anxiety. And again, that's not our fault. That's part of being human. Now, the last systems, it's last but definitely not least, is the soothing system, the green circle. And when we're in this system, we feel contented, we feel safe, protected, cared for. There's a real sense of trust and security. Oxytocin is the brain hormone that kind of underlies this system. That's the hormone of trust. Now, warm, compassionate, supportive relationships can help us into our soothing system. So this is what good relationships help us to get into green. And the great thing about green is that it has a calming effect on the other systems. So if you're in your soothing system, that has a really calm effect on your threat system. It helps you to feel less anxious, less angry. It also can calm your drive system down too, so that you can rest and be at peace. So this is a really important system. So the idea behind the compassionate approach to well-being is that for emotional health, we need all of those three systems in balance. They all need to be about roughly the same size, because that's how we've evolved. That's how we've evolved to be. But unfortunately, in today's competitive, performance-driven cultures, and I include education systems, I think from around the globe now, that have become quite competitive and quite performance-driven, very focused on outcomes. In those sorts of cultures, our threat and drive systems tend to dominate, and that makes us stressed. Okay, it's not good for us, it's not good for our emotional health, it's not good for our physical health either. So the idea is that most people would benefit from building the green system, and focusing on great relationships with other people is one way to do that, because relationships can help us into the green system. So I just want you to take a few minutes, and maybe you can respond in the chat box. Which circles are you in today? We move in between these circles all the time, from moment to moment, and we also sometimes can be in two systems. So today, this morning, I've had quite a nice relaxing morning. I've been able to meditate. I took my dog for a walk. So I was very much in my green system, in my soothing system. But now, as I'm presenting to you, I have one foot in drive, because I really want to deliver you a great webinar, and I want to help you to learn about developing relationships with your students. That's really important to me. So I have one foot in drive, but I've also got a sort of toe in my threat system too. I'm a little bit anxious just because I want to do well and I don't want to let anybody down. So those are the circles I'm in, and that's great. I can see people are already responding, and there's a whole range. And it's important to remember to say we move from system to system, from moment to moment, and sometimes we can be in 2 or 3 systems at once. It's also helpful when you're back in the classroom to start to think about which system is the student in, or is the group of students in, because that can really help you start to understand them and understand where they're at emotionally. Okay, so that hopefully has given you a brief introduction to the model that I'm using to base my understanding of relationships, and particularly how important relationships are in the classroom. And now we're going to move on to focus more on the relationships themselves. We're going to start, though, talking about what we don't want. And I have chosen here an extract from Matilda, a book for children written by the wonderful Roald Dahl. And the setting for this scene takes place in a classroom in Matilda's school. And Miss Trunchbull is Matilda's head teacher, headmistress, and she's not very popular. In 2 large strides, the Trunchbull was behind Eric's desk, and there she stood, a pillar of doom towering over the helpless boy. Eric glanced fearfully back over his shoulder at the monster. "I was right, wasn't I?" he murmured nervously. "You are wrong," the Trunchbull barked. "In fact, you strike me as the sort of poisonous little pockmark that will always be wrong. You sit wrong, you look wrong, you speak wrong. You are wrong all round." Now, unfortunately, this particular extract, and actually why I picked it, was because it reminded me of some experiences I had in my own school days. Now, of course, that's going back a bit now. But I think in the past, there was a model of teaching style that was quite authoritarian in nature. I think some teachers felt they had to be distant from the students in front of them. They had to be aloof, and they had to be sort of in control of them in a quite punitive way. But fear is not a good basis for a teacher-student relationship, and I'm sure most of you realise that. As I mentioned before, doing a dance between your threat system and your drive system is absolutely exhausting. They're very intense, powerful experiences, these systems. And particularly, being in threat compromises engagement in the classroom. You don't want to have the students in front of you in their threat systems for too long. Now, they are occasionally going to pop into threat because you're going to challenge them. You're going to ask them to do things they haven't done before. And that's a good thing. But we want to help them out of their threat system as much as we possibly can. And there are some really good psychological reasons for this. There are many, many studies in the psychological literature that say that anxiety causes an over-focus on any danger in the environment around us. And so the students, if they're in their threat system, they're going to be focused on their mistakes. They're going to take them as criticism. They're going to be looking out for signs of social rejection, both from you and from their peer group around them. They're also going to be spending a lot of their processing capacity thinking about what's going to go wrong and how they can try to prevent that, because that's what we do in the threat system. That's what it was evolved to do. It was evolved to keep us safe. But all of that worrying takes up processing capacity. And anxiety is very much both a mind and body condition. So when we have a burst of adrenaline, as I'm sure you're familiar, adrenaline increases our heart rate, it can make us shake, it can make us feel slightly sick. So the threat system actually hijacks the whole body and focuses it on danger. So if you've got your students in threat, they are simply not going to be able to engage in effective learning in the classroom. These are some of the reactions you might have. I'm just going to go through these briefly. If you're in threat, or the students in front of you rather are in threat, some of them might react with a fight reaction. So they might react with a bit of an aggressive attitude towards you. And I'm sure some of you have had that in the classroom. Another reaction is the flight reaction, so a panicky reaction where the student wants to run away. Another reaction, which I just want to raise your awareness of, is that the student might freeze. And that actually comes from the ancient part of the brain. the reptilian part of the brain, where reptiles, if they sense a danger, they quite often will play dead. And that can sometimes happen to humans too. So if a student in your classroom who seems to have frozen and can't respond to you, you really need to take the pressure off that student and just give them some time to calm down and relax. And then students can also try to appease you, and that's because they see you as a social threat. And again, you don't want that, because the reason that they're doing what they're doing is to appease you rather than the fact that they're motivated with their own learning. So this is what we really want in the classroom. We want students to be moving mostly between their soothing system, where they feel contented, they feel safe and secure, to their drive system, where they're working really hard towards their goals. This is what we're aiming for. And the research shows this too. So there's been research, there's pieces of research in the educational literature showing that from the student's point of view, feeling as if they belong, feeling affiliated with their teachers, that's associated with higher levels of achievement, higher levels of motivation, and it helps the students to self-regulate their emotions too. And of quite a lot of importance, there is research showing that emotionally supportive classrooms with really high quality relationships has a positive effect on student behaviour. And I know that behavioural issues can be really challenging for teachers sometimes, and it's something that concerns teachers. So it's worth knowing that if you invest in your relationships with your students, hopefully that will have a really positive effect on their behaviour in the class. So, okay, so that's what we're aiming for, but let's think about what a good relationship with a student-teacher relationship is really like. And to do this, I just want you to take a couple of minutes to think about your own experiences. Take a couple of deep breaths, and if you're in a situation where you can, close your eyes, because that will help you to visualize and remember. Think of a teacher from your own school days that you had a good relationship with. How did you feel with that teacher? How did they relate to you? What did they say? What made you feel good when you were with them? And then in contrast, think of a teacher from your own school days that you had a poorer relationship with, who you didn't get on with so well. How did they make you feel? And what do you think they did that was making you feel in that way? And then think about the difference between those two relationships. And if you could put your memories, your observations, if you're comfortable to share those in the chat box, that would be great. Because interactive learning and sharing ideas is always great for our own development. Thank you. While you're noting those down in the chat box, I'm going to start to introduce you to the idea of attachment. Now, some of you might be familiar with attachment. It's a very well-known theory of child development that was devised by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the 60s and 70s, and many, many researchers have looked into attachment since. But what Bowlby and Ainsworth proposed was that we all have an attachment system in our brain. It's an innate system, so it's present from birth, and it's the system that helps the infant survive and helps the infant to communicate to the caregiver what it needs. So it's basically the system that makes a baby cry when it's hungry, when it's cold, when it's tired, and encourages the caregiver to respond to that need. So that's called the attachment system. But what Bowlby and Ainsworth worked out is that this system learns. And over time, this system develops a model for relationships. So our early experiences with caregivers influence all of our relationships throughout childhood and later on into adulthood. And this is really important. I'm just going to go into a little more detail. If a student in front of you had a caregiver, a parent, or somebody else that was responsible for looking after them when they were young, who was overprotective, that can signal to the child that the world is a very unsafe place and that they can only explore the world when their parent is there with them. That they need other people to explore and face challenges in the world. And I'm sure that you've had students in your classroom that seem to require quite a lot of encouragement, quite a lot of reassurance to face difficult challenges or to face new tasks. And that's probably because they've had an early experience with a caregiver who was just slightly overprotective. And so they have a slightly anxious style of relating. They feel like they need people and they're somewhat lacking in confidence. The other end of the attachment spectrum, sometimes children can have caregivers who, for whatever reason, fail to respond to that child's needs. And those children can develop quite an avoidant style of relating in relationships later on. Those young people and adults can find it difficult to connect in relationships. They can find it difficult to trust people because early on in life, their needs weren't always met. So that's an avoidant style of attachment in relationships. And then in the middle, you have caregivers who've been able to give young children the right balance of encouraging them to go off and explore the world, but also being there to meet their needs. And these children go on to have what we call secure relationships and secure attachment styles, where they're confident to go off and face challenges and explore the world because they know if they need help, someone will respond to them. And it's nobody's fault. Again, this is part of the human condition. People have different attachment styles. And of course, not only will the student have different attachment styles, so will teachers too. But this can help explain some of the ways in which some students might seem to be quite dependent on you. Some students might be difficult to connect with, whereas other students can be really confident in the classroom. And that explains it. But when we're working with our students, we're trying to promote a very secure relationship. We want them to be able to explore new ideas, face challenges in the classroom, but we also want to be able to respond to their needs. We want to be able to help them when they need help. And secure relationships are based on trust, safety, and respect. So, these are some of the qualities of what a secure relationship has. And I'm not going to be prescriptive here. We're all individual characters. We've all got different personalities and different styles of relating. And thank goodness for that. Otherwise, the world would be a very, very boring place. But there are some common qualities to relationships that feel very secure. The first one of these is that they're validating. And to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a little story from my own school days about an experience I had with a teacher. And it was probably the most validating experience I've ever had in my life. And it has helped me enormously. And I still remember it 32 years later. I had a school report when I was about 13. I had a school report where every single subject teacher had said that I was too quiet in the classroom. They'd all said, all 9 or 10 of them had said, she is too quiet in class. She needs to speak up more. And I was going through my report with my form tutor, who'd had me for a few years and knew me quite well. And I was quite upset about this because I perceived that as a criticism. I was really keen to do well at school and felt really criticised by the teachers. My form tutor turned to me and he said to me, Kate, it's okay to be quiet. Imagine what the world would be like if it was full of loud and noisy people. And that was the most wonderful statement. It's one of the best things anybody has ever said to me. He validated my own character and my own experience. And that's really important in a relationship, to get to know that individual and to validate their experience rather than encouraging them to be different all of the time. Validate how they actually are. The second quality of a secure relationship is attunement, and that's really being aware of how you are emotionally and how the other person is emotionally. So are you aware of how your students are feeling? Are they keen? Are they motivated? Or actually, are they feeling a bit challenged by this topic? And do you need to reassure them or help them in some way? So that's being attuned to the class, and that's really important. Being responsive, I think that speaks for itself. Just being responsive to any needs that class have, being aware of the needs. And of course, individual students have very different needs, so being as responsive as you can. A secure relationship, though, supports autonomy. Remember, the parent that encourages the child to explore. So we want our students to engage in autonomous learning as much as we can, and that's really important. Being consistent with students as well is vital. It's very difficult for a student to relate to you if you are inconsistent in the way you react to them. So we all have different characters, different personalities, different styles of teaching, but it's quite important to try to be consistent with the students. Otherwise, they don't quite know what's going on and it makes them feel insecure. Being authentic is also important. So being as real and as honest as you can with your students, because that will help them trust you. And again, last but not least is boundaries. So I'm not suggesting when you're building relationships with your students that you're going to be everybody's best friends, because that's absolutely not appropriate. You need to work out for yourself what the boundaries are within a student-teacher relationship, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And you'll have boundaries about all sorts of things. So you might have boundaries about what you're prepared to discuss about your personal life with students and what you're not. You almost certainly will have boundaries about what behaviour is acceptable and what's not. And it's important to enforce those boundaries, and boundaries are good for students. Boundaries, again, help them feel safe and secure, and they help the students to respect you and to trust you. So boundaries are really important. And so we're not aiming to be everyone's best friend, and we're aiming to have appropriate boundaries. Okay, what are you saying but not saying? So now we come on to the importance of non-verbal communication. As I said in my introduction, when you think about it, emotion is a non-verbal communication. You know how your friend is feeling just by looking at them, because the emotional systems predate, in evolutionary terms, language. So they are read very quickly and very subconsciously by the older parts of our brain. So our non-verbal communication sort of gives us away, actually, and it's important to be aware of it when you're in the classroom. I think teachers are always aware of what they're saying verbally, but I think we could pay more attention to what our body language is saying to the students. What are our facial expressions to them? What is our tone of voice like? Are we giving away our emotions with our tone of voice? So these are important things to think about. And the attachment system, the system for building relationships, is particularly sensitive to non-verbal communication. An example of that is an experiment from psychology, and it's called the visual cliff. I encourage you to look it up on YouTube. Just Google the visual clip and you'll get a short video. It's only 2 or 3 minutes long. And this is an experiment in psychology with parents and crawling babies. And they asked the babies, they put the babies on a table, and they asked the parents to encourage the baby to crawl towards them. So the parent was at the other end of the table, and the table had an obstacle on it. What they found is when they told the parents to have fearful facial expressions, so the parents weren't saying, they weren't allowed to make any noise, they weren't saying anything. When the parents had fearful facial expressions, the babies do not cross the visual cliff. They don't cross the obstacle. They stay where they are. So young babies can read a face and know that that signals danger. When the parents were encouraged to have a warm, smiling, encouraging expression, the babies crawled towards them. And I just want you to think about that as a bit of a metaphor for what's going in your classroom. Think of the visual cliff as a metaphor for the challenges you're asking the students to face in the classroom. Maybe you're asking them to do a test. Maybe you're asking them to present at the front of the class. Anything which a student might find challenging, that is their visual cliff. Then think about which face you are giving them. Are you giving them an encouraging face, or are you giving them a fearful face? And I actually use this in my personal life as well, because my husband has an awful tendency that when I'm discussing challenges that I'm facing, to have a fearful expression on his face. And all that does is makes me more anxious. So I've actually told him, no, this is my visual cliff. You need to have a warm, smiling, friendly face, please, because I need some encouragement and support now. So that's some of the joys of being married to a psychologist. Another thing to be very aware of when you're in the classroom is your body language. You can see there that the teacher in the picture looks very calm, relaxed. Her body language, her body posture is quite open, and she's also got very good eye contact with her students. And that's really important, to have a very warm, approachable body posture. Eye contact is vital, but you have to be a little bit careful with it. Teenagers particularly are quite sensitive to eye contact. So you use it to engage with them, but it's important not to stare at a teenager because they may actually find that quite threatening. So use eye contact to engage with the young people in your classroom and to encourage them. So now we're on to difficult relationships with students. As I say, this is part of the human condition. We all find some people easier to relate to than others, and that applies in the classroom as much as anywhere else. I want you to think about a student that you've got at the moment that you find a bit challenging to relate to. Have a think about what that student does to your emotions. How do you feel when you're with them? What facial expression do you use, and what voice tone do you use, and what do you think your body language does? Just take a few moments to think about how you feel. And I am willing to bet that most of you, when you're facing a student that you find quite challenging to deal with, get put into your threat system. So difficult relationships can put us into threat, and that's because social relationships are so important to us. Humans have evolved to exist in social groups. That's very important for our survival. So if we're finding a relationship challenging, we're very easily triggered into our threat system. There's a bit of an issue with that in the classroom because threat makes us tense. It might make us nervous or angry. It also makes us more judgmental and decreases our empathy. And we become a lot more reactive, more punitive, and just less able to problem solve. So what you really want to avoid as much as possible in your classroom is what I call the battle of the threat systems. If you go into your threat system, there's a good chance that the student in front of you will also go into their threat system, because we tend to mirror emotional states. And then you're going to get nowhere. You're just going to end up reacting to each other rather than responding to each other. So what can you do in that situation? The first thing, stay curious, okay? Stay curious. Don't judge yourself. Be kind to yourself. It's tricky being human, okay? It's tricky being human. It's okay. Stay curious about what's going on. a few techniques that might help move you from your threat system back into your soothing system. And as I said, if you manage to get into your soothing system, it could be that you'll help the student to get back into their soothing system too. You can take deep, slow breaths. And I mean breathing right down into your diaphragm. And that's been shown to activate our soothing system. So take deep, slow breaths. And you can do this in the moment with the student in front of you. Try and relax your face, because relaxing facial muscles tends to relax the whole body. And try and relax anywhere else that you might have tense parts of your body, and particularly your hands. I find that when you're facing someone who you're finding quite challenging, the hands tend to clench up into fists. So try and release that and just wiggle your fingers. You can say helpful self-statements. So you can be self-compassionate and just say to yourself, this is difficult, but I'm doing my best. It's really difficult, but I'm doing my best. Remember that that particular student, one of the reasons you might have problems relating to them is they may have had very difficult or unhelpful early relationships. It's nobody's fault. It's part of the human condition. And those 3 techniques can help you move from your threat system into your soothing system. And then when the moment has gone, hopefully later in the day, you might have some time to connect with a colleague and just chat about it, because that will prevent you going over and over the situation in your mind and kind of judging yourself. Have a chat to a supportive colleague about what happened. And I love this quote, treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you help them become what they are capable of becoming. And I think that's true for all of the students in your class. And finally, just to finish off, these are top tips from the experts, okay? So these are tips from teachers that I've spoken to before about the teacher-student relationship, and I love all of them. So the first one is that the teachers say, be human. Okay, be human in front of your students, and a good way to do that is to take part in extracurricular activities, maybe run a school club, go on a school trip, so the students get to know you in a more personal sense as well as just in the classroom. Respect. Teenagers in particular hate to be patronised, so appreciate them as equals, listen to them as equals, and if you respect your students, they will reciprocate that and they will respect you. Respect and trust the students. Humour. Never underestimate the influence of humour. I use it in therapy sometimes. If someone is becoming overwhelmed with emotion, just a little bit of humour used very sensitively can really help them, just lift them out of their state of distress. And humour can really break a kind of atmosphere in a classroom, can't it? So use humour. Don't be afraid to use humour. Be playful sometimes. Openness. Role model how to react to mistakes. Don't role model that mistakes are nothing to be afraid of, and that's how we learn. Be open with them, and also be honest. Be prepared to apologise if you have made a mistake and that's had an unwanted repercussion for the students. Apologise, just like you would like the students to apologise if they've done something inappropriate. Be prepared to apologise to the students too. That's not a sign of weakness, and they will really appreciate and respect you for that. Okay, so going forward, you are the experts. You have the wisdom inside you, and you will learn from your experiences in the classroom. So going forward with your colleagues, why don't you have a session, or maybe over coffee, discuss your top tips for building relationships, and don't be afraid to talk about the more challenging relationships, because that's where our greatest learning can occur. So dare to be vulnerable with your colleagues. And coming back to my compassion challenge, what's the one thing you're going to do differently now that you've heard my talk? What are you going to try to do differently or to think about differently the next time you're in the classroom? Okay, so I think we're going to have a Q&A time.
Hi everybody, hi Kate, thanks so much for such an interesting webinar. So if you've got any questions, please type them in the chat box. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. But just to kick off, Mariana asked, what's your opinion about teachers who teach sitting down?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. I think obviously some people may choose to be seated because of different physical abilities, and that's fine if that's easier for them and more comfortable for them. I suppose my instinct is because non-verbal body language is so important. I think if you can move around the classroom and actually interact with the students in that way, and not just from the front of the classroom either, so actually approach your students either individually or in groups and really connect with them, I think that would be preferable. But I do understand that some teachers, as I say, may not have physical abilities to do that.
Great. And this wasn't really a question, but it was something that I picked up on in the chat. There was a bit of a discussion about what if your school doesn't really like you having a good relationship with your students? What if it kind of encourages that more authoritative behaviour? How do you overcome that?
Sorry, Laura, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it.
It came up in the chat, a discussion about schools who don't want to encourage good teacher-student relationships for whatever reason. Perhaps they prefer a more authoritative approach.
Gosh.
That teachers can approach that situation.
Okay, wow. I suppose the first thing I would say is maybe play your educational managers this webinar. Might be the first way to address that. I do appreciate that some cultures and some education systems might have a more authoritarian way of approaching teaching, but I think that misses a lot. I do think relationships are just key to our well-being. They're key to how we interact, to how we learn, to how we grow. We are social animals. We evolved to live in social groups, and there is quite a lot of research now about students who feel affiliated with their teachers, who feel like their teachers respect them and value them, that they do better. They have higher achievement. They achieve greater outcomes. So I think you could look up the research perhaps and present that to some of your managers. And as I say, this isn't about being everyone's best friend, and that's not appropriate as a teacher. It's a completely different relationship you have with your students, but it's about being supportive, encouraging, and warm, and being approachable, so that they can ask you for help, and so that you can respond to their needs, and that way they're going to learn. The other thing I would say is to have a think about when people are resistant to an approach or to a change, there's normally a fear behind that. So what is the fear behind not building warm, compassionate relationships with students? What is the fear there? So to have an open and honest discussion about it would be very useful, and to discuss the pros and cons of different styles. Those would be my recommendations.
And a question from Aisha: How how can you develop a good relationship with students who are aggressive towards other students?
Gosh, yes, this one has come up before. I think that's one of the most challenging situations, isn't it? It's sometimes we don't mind. It's almost like we care less about ourselves. We don't mind when people are aggressive towards us, but when they're aggressive towards other people, that can be very upsetting. To think about that compassionately, it's worthwhile taking some time to reflect on what that student's life might be like outside school, what their early experiences might have been like, and why they are displaying so much aggression. Because it's quite likely they've had experiences in their life that have been very, very unpleasant, and that they have had experiences of relationships and of caregiving that just hasn't met their needs. And that's probably why they're being aggressive. To have confidence in the ways that you're supporting and managing behaviour in the classroom too. So to make sure that there's a good behavioural policy in your school and that you're very clear on it, that you're very clear and consistent in the way that you deliver that, and being fair. So you know there's some kind of system in place to manage the interactions between students if they do become aggressive. But I would also say to try to be compassionate and supportive towards that student, because you may be the only person in their life that has showed respect towards them, that values them, that is prepared to show some trust if they reciprocate it. And you've got to start somewhere, haven't you? People, and particularly young people, deserve a chance. So teachers, please never forget how important you are in the lives of the young people that you teach. You have a massive influence. And as I say, I've had several relationships with teachers that improved my life dramatically. And I gave you an example during the talk. You could be the one person to make a massive difference with this student. Now, compassion is not just about warmth, it's not just about kindness and support. Compassion is also about courage, strength, and wisdom. So when you're dealing with that student, it's going to require quite a lot of strength, it's going to require a lot of courage, and also wisdom as well. But I would give them a chance, try to believe in them, because if you don't, there's no way forward, and you may be the one person that can make a real difference in their lives.
Brilliant. I think if anything, I've seen through the chat box that there seems to be so many people who were really inspired to become teachers because of teachers that they had when they were younger. So it just shows how a supportive relationship, supportive teacher-student relationship really can make that difference. That's brilliant. So unfortunately, that's all we've got time for.
That's
today.
Lovely.
But don't forget to check out our events page for details of our upcoming webinars, which you can visit at cambridge.org/ELT events. The recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and YouTube channel next week. And please don't forget to download your certificate from the link on screen that's just about to appear. Don't forget to download your certificate from the link that's coming up now. So thanks very much everybody, and thanks Kate for such a fascinating webinar, and hope to see you in future webinars again soon.